Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone, and welcome to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I am your host, Joanna. Let's get started. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Bouncing Back. I'm your host Joanna, and today we are going to be chatting about women's mental health, and we're also going to be talking about hormones and cognitive intersection. So I'd love to welcome our guest, Caroline Gurvich. Caroline is the Deputy Director of Her Centre Australia, the head of the Cognition and Hormones Group, and also an Associate Professor at Monash University. Hi Caroline, so lovely to have you with us.
Hi, Joanna. Thank you very much for having me.
Of course. Before we dive into today's topic, I'd love if you could tell us a bit more about who you are and what it is you do.
Sure. So I'm a clinical neuropsychologist. So I did a doctorate of clinical neuropsychology many years ago at Monash University in Australia and developed a real interest in how we think and how our brains work and what cognition is, which is our thinking skills, and what happens when it goes wrong. And I did a postdoctoral research session years looking at trying to understand cognition in schizophrenia, which is a severe mental illness where there's often cognitive impairment. And I was really interested in the biology of the cognitive impairment, what was underpinning that, what were the genetics involved. And then from there, I started to become interested in women's mental health and cognition. And that was partly inspired by Professor Jayshree Kulkarni, who is the director of our research centre, and she's the leading expert in women's mental health. And I became particularly interested in that intersection between women's mental health and cognition and thinking skills. And that's led me to my own research over the past few years and clinical work, which has focused it on mainly on neuropsychology, so understanding brain and behaviour relationships and cognition in women and how hormones impact cognition.
Great. That sounds so interesting, and I'm so keen to get into today's topic as well. But before we do that, we have a section called Have You Met Caroline? So here we just ask you some little get to know you questions. So my first one for you is, what is your favourite book?
Well, favourites are tricky. I never really have favourite books, but I do absolutely love reading, and I've always got a book on the go. So over the last, year or so, my favourites have been probably within the area of historical fiction. So I just finished reading a book called The Island of Sea Woman, which I really enjoyed, and that was about set in South Korea, about divers and around the time of the Second World War, and found that really fascinating. I also recently read Hamnet, which was about William Shakespeare's son, historical fiction, which I also really enjoyed. Dictionary of Lost Words is another book I recently read, also historical fiction. So at the moment, that's been my go-to kind of genre for books that I've really enjoyed.
Great. And would you have a recommendation for us, for people who are trying to get into historical fiction?
Yeah, any of those that I mentioned, I think are great books to discover that area of reading. And then I guess it's just finding different topics that you like and trying different books and seeing if you get into them.
Yeah, such a fun process. I love trying new genres and discovering how many different little sub-genres exist in a genre as well. It's a great process.
Yes, and the process of walking around a bookstore or library and finding the books is just as enjoyable as reading them.
Oh, 100%. I'm not sure if you've been to the Dimmicks in the city here in Melbourne, but it's one of my favorite bookstores. It's like the perfect bookstore to just like walk around and just be so overwhelmed by the amount of books that are in a store. It's perfect.
Yeah, I haven't been there, but I do love that feeling.
Yeah, great. Well, I've got another question here, which is there a movie that you've watched recently that you would recommend or that you've just loved?
So probably not a movie. I don't really get to the movies too much other than really with my children and seeing children's movies, which I don't mind, but I tend to watch series and Netflix series more. I just finished watching Ripley on Netflix, which I really enjoyed. It's a thriller. So I really enjoyed that. And I'm also totally different genre, but really looking forward to Bridgerton. There's a new series of Bridgerton coming out. So I'm also very excited about that.
Yes, I'm so excited. I think it's May 15th or 16th, I believe.
Okay.
That it comes out. So in a couple of weeks. So very exciting.
It's around the corner. So that will be probably the next series on my list.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And did you say Ripley's?
Just Ripley.
Ripley? What's that one about?
Ripley. So it's a thriller and it's a series on Netflix. I probably don't want to say too much for people who haven't seen it yet to give anything away, but it's a really interesting series I found quite gripping.
Okay, amazing. I'll have to give that a go. I love recommendations and I love thriller as a genre. So great. And I've got a couple more questions here for you. So are you listening to any podcasts at the moment?
I do enjoy podcasts. I listen, probably nothing hugely exciting or inspiring for the general population, but I love to listen to sort of current affairs and news and also world news. And also there's a podcast I love called Navigating Neuropsychology, but that's probably not a recommendation for the general public. It's quite focused on neuropsychology, but I really enjoy that.
Yeah, great. Is there any genre you would say that you want to get into or that you're curious to try out?
For podcasts? Or maybe some of those true crime ones. There was probably when podcasts first came out, that was how I got into podcasts, and then somehow my listening switched to more educational type podcasts. So I probably need to get back to something that's a little bit more interesting and keeps me a bit more gripped.
I was hoping you'd say true crime because I have the perfect recommendation for you. I give this recommendation to everyone. It's called Red Handed. It's hosted by these two women from the UK and it's such a great true crime podcast. They're funny and they just go through cases in like a really exciting way and you're kind of like on the edge of your seat. I love it. So I highly recommend it.
Okay, Red Handed.
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay, I'll write it down. Excellent. Thank you.
That's okay. And I've got one last question for you, which is, do you have a role model?
I don't have a famous role model that people would know, but I feel like for me, I get my inspiration or consider my role models just the people around me, like my husband, my children, my parents, and family, friends. And I feel like I look up to all of those people in different ways and they inspire me in different ways, and work colleagues as well. And so I'm not someone who's ever looked up to a famous person and wanted to be like them, but I definitely get inspired and look up to everyone who's close to me.
Yeah, perfect. I'm the same as well. I have famous people that I look up to because they're famous for a reason. They're doing great things. But I also find that it's just the everyday people in my life. I take like little things from them and I find those things inspirational. And I always see them in my life. So I'm like, the perfect role models anyway, because I always see them doing these things.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, that's the same for me.
Yeah, great. Well, let's dive into today. So we're dealing with a few complex concepts, I'd say. So I'd love to start off by defining what we mean by like hormones when we talk about them.
Sure. So the main hormones I'm referring to when I'm talking about the impact of hormones and hormonal changes on the brain and on the way we think and cognition and behavior are probably estrogen and progesterone, so the two main sex hormones, and they're the hormones that fluctuate, as well other hormones also do, but they're the hormones that fluctuate, and they're the hormones that have probably been most well studied. So that's where most of our evidence and understanding has come from in terms of how these hormones impact the brain and then the flow-on effects to our behaviour and our cognition.
Yeah. And when we talk about like hormonal fluctuations through a woman's life, such as like during puberty or those sort of like milestone important parts, how does that impact a woman or a young girl's mental health?
So from puberty, that's the first time that there's an impact of hormones. And that's also around the time of puberty is when we start to see changes in the prevalence of things like depression and anxiety, and they become a lot more prevalent in adolescent girls compared to younger girls and boys. And so for women, they have, or adolescent girls, that's when menstrual cycles commence at puberty. And so we have this cyclical fluctuation in estrogen and progesterone. And for some girls, they choose to take oral or hormonal contraceptive pills, and that can impact our hormonal levels as well. And there can also be flow-on effects to mood and to cognition and behaviour if people take contraceptive pills. But the impacts that we see of hormones on our mental health and on our cognition commences around puberty. And then there are certain times in a woman's life where there are significant hormonal changes. So pregnancy and in the perinatal postnatal period, we see really big changes in our hormones. There's also big life changes, so we can't attribute everything to hormones. And another phase of life where there's significant hormone changes is menopause. And so again, there are also life changes and psychosocial changes, but there's also really significant hormonal changes. So right across a woman's lifespan, we have either cyclical or significant hormone changes. And this contrasts to a male's hormone status, which is pretty steady across the lifespan.
So when we talk about all these concepts with like hormones, I feel like it can be really confusing because not a lot of people know a lot about it. Like me, myself, like I hear all these words like estrogen and I'm like, I kind of get what it means, but I also don't. And I feel like that's so important in understanding your body and what happens. And when things do happen, it'll make more sense when you do have that information. So I'd love if we could talk about the role of estrogen and progesterone in regulating our moods and explaining what happens to our bodies.
Sure. That's such a good question, Joanna, because I think everyone knows or potentially has heard of estrogen and progesterone as being our sex hormones or our reproductive hormones. And we know that they regulate aspects of our bodily functions like our menstrual cycle, and we know they're implicated in pregnancy and menopause. But I think less people know that we also have receptors in our brains that respond to these hormones. So when they change their levels in our body, that also has an impact on our brain, and that is why we can see changes in mood and in cognition and in behaviour when these hormones change. So they don't just regulate our reproductive function, they also flow into our brains. And the receptors, which are the bits of the brain that respond to these hormones, are in brain areas that are really important for regulating our mood and regulating our thinking skills. So the names of these brain areas that people may or may not have heard of, one area is the hippocampus, and that's in the temporal lobe, middle bit of our brain. And the hippocampus is really important for our memory. And also in the temporal lobe is another part of our brain called the amygdala that's really important for regulating our mood and our emotions. And the other area in the brain that there's lots of estrogen and progesterone receptors is the front part of our brain. And the front part of our brain is a little bit like the CEO of our brain or the conductor of our brain. It's the bit of our brain that helps coordinate everything and makes sure we make the right decisions and focus our attention on the right things and monitor our own behavior and our thoughts. And it's involved in sort of goal-directed behaviors. And so that means that the emotion centers of our brain, the memory centers of our brain, and the coordinating goal motivation type areas of our brain are all impacted when our estrogen and progesterone receptors are stimulated at different times. And when these hormone levels change, these areas of our brain changes as well. So that means that we can have changes in our mood, we can have changes in our memory, and we can have changes in our sort of motivational, goal-directed behaviors when hormones change. So one other part of our brain that's important to understand in relation to hormones is that these hormones also interact with neurotransmitter systems in our brain that people might have heard of that are also really important for mood and cognition. So estrogen interacts with serotonin. So people sometimes heard of serotonin as a neurotransmitter that's really important for regulating our mood. And estrogen also interacts with dopamine, which is another neurotransmitter system that's really important for our motivation. And the other one that's important for our cognition is the GABAergic system in our brain. So estrogen and progesterone both interact with GABA, and that's important for cognition and also really relevant for mood. So I guess by interacting with brain areas important for mood and cognition, as well as interacting with brain chemical or neurotransmitter systems that are really important for mood and cognition, are the kind of biological ways in which these hormones, when they change, can impact how we think and how we feel.
Yeah, so how do these hormonal fluctuations cause challenges to our mental health, or how do they impact, our mental health?
Yeah, so we don't fully understand why some people are more sensitive to hormone fluctuations, because some people aren't at all. Some people are not aware of any changes in their mood or their thinking skills across their menstrual cycle or across menopause or across pregnancy. But some people are particularly sensitive to these hormone fluctuations. So for some women across their menstrual cycle, in that premenstrual period, so that's just before someone has their period, we see a change in estrogen and progesterone, so an increase in progesterone, particularly in this time. And for some women, their mood changes and they notice significant changes premenstrually. For some women, that's quite debilitating, and some women notice nothing. So we don't understand why, but some people are particularly sensitive to hormone fluctuations. And it's the same during menopause. There's some women who glide through menopause and notice no changes at all to their thinking skills or their mood, but there's a subset of women who are really impacted and are really probably sensitive to the hormone fluctuations. And for those women, they might experience symptoms of brain fog during menopause, or they might experience depression that might be a recurrence of a previous depression, or it might be de novo, like no experience of depression in their life up until menopause. And then when their hormones start changing and fluctuating, we have this sort of rapid fluctuation of estrogen in that kind of lead up to menopause called perimenopause, and then a overall decline in estrogen levels. For some women, that's enough to trigger an onset of depression. So there are different theories as to why some women are more sensitive to the hormone fluctuations, and it's probably a combination of individual variation in genetics. There's different theories about people who have been exposed to early life adversity and trauma becoming more sensitive to hormone fluctuations, and a combination of different things is probably likely to make some people more sensitive to their hormones.
Yeah, and I'm guessing, based on what you've been saying, that can be quite a jarring experience and quite terrifying, especially if you've had no experience with depression and then suddenly it all hits, and it hits hard. So for women who are going through that and trying to understand these changes or these fluctuations going on, how can they, cope with this? How can they build resilience through these times?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I think the first thing is just having an understanding that hormones might impact your mental health, your well-being, your thinking skills. So I think that's the first step. I think knowledge is really empowering. And I think it can be really scary when people don't know why they might be feeling a certain way, why their mood might have changed. And it can be the same for some people starting certain types of hormonal contraceptive pills. The link is not necessarily made that because of these hormonal changes, mood changes can happen. And so I think that the first step is just to reflect on your own mood and your mental health and your cognition, your sharpness in thinking. And one, see if you're someone who's younger, is there a cyclical pattern to this? Have I just started taking a new hormonal contraceptive pill? If it's someone who is in their sort of 40s, thinking, is this perimenopause? Is this the start of the menopause transition years? Because those perimenopausal years can span up to 10 years. So it's menopause is defined as 12 months after someone's final menstrual period. But in the sort of probably 4 to 10 years up until that point, there can be quite significant hormonal fluctuations. And so it might not be the first thing that comes to someone's mind when they're feeling irritable or helpless or hopeless that this could be related to hormonal changes. So I think the first step is just reflecting on what might be going on within your body that might be relevant to why your mood's changed. And then seeking help, I think reaching out to a really good general practitioner who has an understanding of hormones and menopause, in the case of menopause, and mood is a really good first step to reaching some sort of or seeking help. And in terms of building resilience, as you said, I think sometimes that can be challenging on your own. And so seeking help can be a really good place to start. And then within yourself to build resilience, I think that knowledge can be really empowering. And once you've got help and supports in place, then you can start working on how to be the most resilient person you can in the face of whatever stressors you're facing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when we go to talk about these types of things and have these conversations, that there is a bit of a stigma that exists around it and talking about it and being so open in it, because for some people it's an awkward topic, or for some people it's just not something you speak about. So how does social, like societal stigma surrounding women's hormonal health sort of contribute to mental health and how we view these things?
I feel like the conversations have got better over the more recent years. I feel like people are now talking more about menopause and perimenopause and talking more about hormones and menstrual cycle. And I think that's helping reduce the stigma. I think the more conversations we can have, the more we can make it just part of our language and our communication and our conversations. I think that can really help. So one, people know that they're not alone in some of the symptoms that they might be experiencing. I think that's a really important factor, that it's not unusual to experience changes in mood, for example, during menopause or during times of hormonal change. So I think the more we can talk about these things, the better it is to make it part of the everyday conversations and make people feel comfortable. And then that can also encourage people to bring it up with their different health practitioners and have conversations.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to talk about like cognitive intersection, because that's something I'm a bit unsure about, and I'm sure it's a concept that not many people know too much about. So would you be able to explain that and what it is?
Yeah, absolutely. So cognition is an umbrella term. It refers to all of our thinking skills. So it's our ability to focus our attention and to hold information in our mind and learn new information, use visual skills, use verbal skills, problem solve. So it's an umbrella term, refers to all of those different skills. In relation to the impacts of hormones, the most common symptom that women describe either premenstrually or during menopause is this idea of brain fog. So brain fog itself is not a medical term. It has been defined just in recent years in scientific literature, and it refers to those kind of lapses in concentration, everyday forgetfulness, difficulties retrieving words, that tip of the tongue feeling where you know a word and you just can't quite retrieve it at that time. So it's that kind of fogginess in your head, and that is the brain fog that women often talk about when they're either in those perimenopausal years or for some women premenstrually. So in terms of where brain fog sits in the brain and how it works, we don't completely understand that, but it tends to map onto more subtle changes in memory and subtle changes in attention. So people might need to try harder to focus to be able to use their attention at its best and to maximize their memory.
Caroline, I'd love to ask if there are specific cognitive intersection points where hormonal fluctuations have a more pronounced effect, and how individuals can navigate through that.
Yeah, so I think the most prominent time points where women seem to describe brain fog or cognitive changes in relation to hormones is menopause. So in particular, the changes tend to be starting in perimenopause, so in those lead up years to achieving menopause. Yeah. So during this time, our hormones, estrogen and progesterone, but estrogen in particular, are really fluctuating and declining. And we also see gradually a rise in some other hormones called follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So perimenopause is a time of significant hormonal flux, hormonal change, and decline in estrogen, which we've talked about is this hormone that has lots of effects on the brain, and the effects on the brain are really protective, neuroprotective effects on the brain. So that time is when women seem to be more vulnerable to hormonal changes. And in our research and in research by others, probably about 60% of women report this experience of brain fog. And for some, it's super subtle and has very little impact. But there are plenty of women who I've met clinically and in research who have significant degrees of brain fog. And for those women, it really impacts their self-esteem. So for some women, that kind of forgetfulness, difficulty retrieving words, difficulty getting started or organising their thoughts on different tasks can have quite a profound impact on work. And sadly, there are some women who just leave work or change their role to a lesser role because while cognitively and in terms of their intelligence, there's not a significant change in their core cognitive skills, the day-to-day experience of brain fog, particularly when women don't make the connection that it might be a transient sort of process or related to their hormones or part of menopause, can just impact people's self-esteem. And they suddenly think, oh, I can't do this anymore. I'm not thinking clearly. I'm not up to it. And sadly, they change their work roles, drop out of work. And then only in later years, they reflect back and think, oh, actually, I think that was part of menopause. And, had I reached out and sought help, I might have been able to manage that differently and get through that phase of my life in a different way. So I think in terms of life stages, I think that perimenopause time is probably the most significant time of hormonal change and the most time that women tend to report the most impactful changes in their cognition.
Yeah, so it's important to know that that time is meant to be full of fluctuation and it's not abnormal to experience that.
Absolutely. So it's not abnormal. It's more common than not to experience some degree of brain fog. And just to reiterate, that doesn't mean that people are no longer up to it. It doesn't mean that there's a change in people's capacity to perform tasks or to think. It just means that day-to-day people might have sort of foggy moments or feel like they need extra supports in place to get them through at that phase of their life.
Yeah. And do you think that nutrition and lifestyle can play a role in sort of influencing women's hormonal balances and mental health as well?
Definitely. I think lifestyle is super important. And there's a lot of evidence as well in the midlife and at different phases of people's lives to talk about sort of modifiable lifestyle factors that can really impact brain health and cognitive health. So particularly during menopause, which we know is this sort of time of, I guess, neurological or neuroendocrine transition, so brain change basically. It's also a time where people can reflect on what's going on in their life, and it often coincides with a time in women's lives where they're really busy. So women are often at the peak of their career because the average age of menopause is 51, which means those perimenopausal years are during the 40s. So women are often at the peak of their career. Sometimes there's young or teenage children. Sometimes there's elderly parents, managing households. There's a lot going on. So that's a factor that also can have an impact on our mental load and our cognitive load and how clearly we can think. So in terms of using this as more menopause as also an opportunity to think, okay, this is a time where I can really build my cognitive health and take this as an opportunity to change some lifestyle things to make sure my brain is as healthy as possible. The evidence that we have so far suggests things like exercise. Exercise has so many benefits on our body, on our brain, and on our cognitive and mental health. So trying to embed regular exercise in someone's life is super important. In terms of nutrition, there's lots of different research studies looking at different types of diets, but probably the one that receives the most evidence base is the Mediterranean diet. So being able to follow kind of a healthy, wholesome diet with lots of, fruits and vegetables and nuts and grains, and that wholesome diet is really important, again, in terms of building brain health and building cognitive health, both for the immediate short-term benefits, but also thinking about longer-term benefits and making sure that when we age, we can do the best we can to have healthy cognitive aging, healthy brain aging. So that's exercise and diet. Then there's different factors that can reduce stress. So minimizing stress, so then we can become more resilient, more able to cope and manage with stress is also another lifestyle factor that's modifiable. So we can't often change the stressors in our life, but we can change how we respond to stress. And being able to find techniques within ourselves to manage stress is really important. So there's plenty of evidence for the benefits of meditation and mindfulness practices on the brain and on building good brain and cognitive health and mental health. Some people find it really challenging to engage in regular meditation. And so it's finding what works for you. And some people, it's more kind of movement-based mindfulness that might be beneficial, like Tai Chi or yoga, or, walking, but in a mindful way where you're aware of your surroundings and you're present and you're not distracted by things like your phone. Somehow embedding as much sort of mindfulness and stress reduction practices into your life is also really important. Then the other areas that are important for building cognitive health, particularly as we age, is social connectedness. So it's a nice excuse to make sure you socialize and enjoy the company of your friends and family. So that's another area that's got an evidence base that being well socially connected is also really good for your mental health and for your cognitive health in midlife and as we age. They're probably the key sort of modifiable lifestyle factors that are really important. The other one, more in terms of healthy brain aging, is building our cognitive reserve. And there's not really any particular task or thing that someone should do in order to build their cognitive reserve. That's just about making sure we use our brains. So just anything that we do engages our brain. So don't be sedentary and, stare at a phone aimlessly. That's not going to build cognitive reserve, but just engaging in any task that you enjoy. That might be work that's stimulating, or it might be reading books or hobbies, but things you enjoy. So that's just an opportunity that any new activities that stretches our brain in some positive way is going to also build our cognitive reserve. So I think they're probably the key lifestyle things that we can do to do the best for our mental health, brain health, and cognitive health.
Yeah. And I love what you mentioned about you can't change the stresses, but you can change how you react to them. And it reminded me of something someone once said to me a long time ago, where it's not about the thing that happens to you, but how you deal with the thing that happens to you. And I feel like that's so important and such a core value of resilience. Like, you can't change the adversity that you're facing or the things that are happening to you, but you can change how you respond to it, how you react, and how you build from that point. And that's such an important point you made. So I just wanted to highlight that because it's just so crucial.
It is. Yeah, I agree. And practicing and being aware of your responses to stressors is a good place to start. So sometimes we talk about not reacting to things with your emotional part of your brain, and that can happen when you're feeling, heightened stress. You just quickly do things that you might later regret, but instead sort of taking pauses and letting that front part of your brain, that higher order executive functions, make good decisions. And sometimes you need a bit of space to let yourself process what's going on, so then you can react in a way that is a bit more resilient.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned social connectedness and socializing. So I wanted to ask more specifically about the role of social support and community during this time and bolstering women's resilience and their confidence within themselves when they're going through periods of hormonal fluctuation or challenges.
Yeah, it's so important. I think at all phases of our life to be socially connected. You know, humans are social beings, and finding your people and people you are supported by and who support you is really important. So it's really crucial to always have a good support network of friends, family, or even more formal peer supports if you feel like you're not getting the right sort of connection or understanding from peers that you might have who might not be experiencing the same kinds of symptoms. We all have individual responses to, for example, hormonal changes during menopause transition. So if your peer group are not experiencing similar things, seeking out some sort of peer group, even if it's like through some sort of online support group or something like that, where you can connect with people at a social level who are understanding and experiencing similar things is really important.
Yeah, and I feel like creating community and creating a movement where people don't feel like they're on their own when they're going through this is so important, because it can feel isolating when something is happening to you and your body and you feel like you're the only person going through it and no one else can relate to you. It can be so isolating.
Yeah, exactly. Important to know that if anyone's experiencing changes in their mental health or cognitive health and it's coinciding with hormone changes, then you may or may not be aware of the underlying hormone changes, but important to know you're not alone.
Yeah, exactly. And I'd love to transition into our practices and habits and really hone in on maybe a practice, a strategy, or even a tool that you suggest to improve our mental sort of health conditions when it comes to this, or when it comes to facing adversity.
Sure. So I guess as a neuropsychologist, my practical strategies tend to relate to cognition, to our thinking skills, and doing what we can to support our thinking skills. So often that always includes looking after our mental health as really a key part of that. But in terms of practical strategies to help with our cognition, things like memory, attention, and being able to perform tasks at a cognitive level, there really are so many very practical strategies people can put in place. So it's simple things like reducing our cognitive load, reducing how many thoughts are buzzing around in our head. So what we call our working memory, which is the part of our brain that allows us to juggle pieces of information, is limited. There's only so much we can hold in our mind at any one time and be consciously aware of that. So we need to reduce the other little thoughts that are often buzzing around in our heads and taking up space. So things like need to get milk, or things like shopping lists, that are taking up space in your head, or the long to-do list. So getting all of those pieces of information onto paper or onto some sort of electronic diary are great strategies just to get things out of your head. And even, workloads where we know we've got 10 different tasks we need to complete and you're sort of thinking, I've got to get to that, I've got to get to that. Finding time in your diary to allocate different tasks so you don't really have to think about it, because you know that next Wednesday morning you've set aside time to do that task, and so you just don't need to think about it now because there is an allocated time that you've set aside to focus on something or to get something done. So I think that's probably the first one, is to reduce your mental load by writing lists, relying on diaries and calendars to really organize your life and your tasks. The other really practical strategy, particularly when people are feeling overwhelmed, is to try and break down tasks. Sometimes things just get, little things or big things can just be too overwhelming to start. So the more you can break down tasks into really small, manageable steps, and putting each of those individual steps, allocating a time in your diary to do those, is a really good strategy to help with that sense of overwhelm. Other strategies are to try and rely on routine as much as possible. And I know for some people that sounds really boring to have a very structured routine, but it's such a good way of reducing that cognitive load. So we don't have to think, okay, when am I going to fit my exercise in, or my meditation practice in, or when am I going to fit that piece of work in, just to have it as a routine so that you get up at a particular time. If you're a morning person, you might exercise in the morning, and it just happens, and you don't have to have that as part of your mental load. It's just something that you do, and it becomes routine, and you just do it all the time. So ensuring that you build sort of healthy lifestyle habits into your routine is also another sort of practical strategy to reduce overwhelm and to reduce mental load.
Yeah, and how do you think doing that and sort of reducing that mental clutter can help change our perception about the things happening to us? For example, the hormonal fluctuations, the changes that are happening in our body, or just adversity.
So I think it just gives us space to think, which is really important. Sometimes when our heads are too full, it's really hard to think clearly because there's not much space to process information. So I think that's the first thing, is just giving yourself a little bit of breathing space, a little bit of head space, like working memory space, just to process information. So that's in terms of being able to respond to, adversity, build up resilience, is just having space, physical, mental, and cognitive space to think about things. And in terms of the times of hormonal flux, I think we probably need them more then. So that's when perhaps there are changes in our brain that might make us a bit more vulnerable to brain fog, or to feeling irritable, or to feeling anxious. And so we just need to make sure that we're giving ourselves a bit more space, a bit more time, just to think about things and process things and look after ourselves.
Yeah, certainly. And if you could give us one piece of advice for people going through a period of change in their life to do with mental health, or, fluctuations within their body or hormones, what would that be?
I think it's just having the knowledge that your hormones do more than regulate your reproductive functions, that your hormones do have a role in mental health and in cognitive health. So if you are experiencing changes in mood, like depression, anxiety, irritability, if you are experiencing brain fog, just reflect on what might be going on in your life and whether hormonal changes might be playing a role. They might not, but whether they are, because then you can go and speak to a GP and speak to them about different options to either stabilize hormones, or replace hormones, or add in different hormones. So I think it's the piece of advice would just be just reflect and have that knowledge that hormones might impact your mental health or cognitive health.
Yeah, and I think it's really important, like as you've been talking, I've been noticing a lot about how it's important to develop curiosity for the things that are happening within your body and mentally as well, because sometimes these things happen and we're just like, oh, that's it. It's just happening to us. We just got to accept it. I don't know why it's happening, but I just got to get through it. But maybe developing a curiosity, being like, okay, this is happening to me, but maybe I can find out more about it so I can deal with it better, or understand it so I don't feel bad that it's happening to me, but, humanize it and be like, okay, this is a part of this, or going through menopause now, or that's why this is happening. And I feel like that can really help with resilience as well, because when you understand what's going on, you can understand how to move past it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, curiosity is always the first step to gaining knowledge about yourself or about the world. So I think, yes, being curious, inquiring, wondering why you might feel the way that you feel, and not just accepting that is crucial.
Yeah. Great. Well, I'd love to end off with our open mic section now. So, Caroline, I'd love to hand it over to you to chat about anything that you'd like to.
I guess clinically, a lot of women I see around perimenopausal years, a couple of the questions that people tend to pose is a lot of anxiety, that people feel like they're developing dementia. So they come and see me because they think I've got dementia, but at the start of Alzheimer's disease, because I'm forgetting things and I never used to forget things, and what's going on. And the other question that people often ask more recently, also around perimenopausal years, is they notice changes in their attention, their regulation of their attention, and people start to query whether they might have ADHD. So that's another clinical question that comes up around the time of menopause. So I guess there are two areas that I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about. So the first one, in terms of dementia and how that might differ from brain fog during menopause. So menopause, the average age is around 50 and the perimenopausal years are in their 40s. So generally women are too young to have late onset dementia. So it's just unlikely that someone would be presenting with dementia purely because of someone's age. The other factor is that when we assess someone in a neuropsychological way around brain fog and differentiating it from a dementia, they're very different presentations clinically. So while someone both with dementia and with brain fog might talk about forgetfulness, the actual underlying picture is totally different. So someone with dementia because of Alzheimer's disease can no longer form new memories. So they are actually forgetting information very rapidly. Whereas someone with menopause, the forgetfulness is because they haven't focused in the first place. So it's more of an attention issue, and that people forget information, but if you probe them, they'll remember it. The information did go in and they can't retrieve it, or the information didn't go in because they weren't attending in the first place. So I think if women are sitting with that concern, speak up and go and see someone about that, because I think sometimes anxiety builds, and anxiety itself can lead to people feeling like they forget things because they're just anxious and again and losing focus. And then the other question about the potential overlap between menopause and ADHD is a space that we're just doing a lot of research in, because there's been very little research looking at how hormones intersect with ADHD. And we did a survey last year and found that a lot of women who have a diagnosis of ADHD, they do notice a worsening during menopause. And it makes sense from a biological point of view, because we know that there are interactions between the hormone estrogen, which declines during menopause, and dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that's really important in ADHD. So I think there is research emerging that either menopause might be undercovering an ADHD presentation that has always been there, or it might be a worsening of a pre-existing ADHD, or it might not be ADHD, but people, if it's just appeared for the first time, there's no signs of it earlier in life, but it might be brain fog that might be managed by different strategies and by different approaches, for example, trying to restore hormone levels. So I think that's one sort of clinical area that I'm really interested in, and that has presented itself to me through a few different or quite a few different women.
Yeah. And that seems quite scary, having that anxiety or thinking that you're like falling into dementia, or you've got ADHD or something like that, and things being unexplainable because you're not sure of what's going on. So for people going through that and they're having these doubts and concerns and this anxiety, is there any other way that they can find support other than reaching out to an expert? And I know we talked about community and, developing our social skills as well as being something that's important.
So I think one really easy strategy to do is just to try and think about your focus and your attention, where you're allocating your attention. So if you try and minimize all the distractions in your environment, particularly your phone that might be distracting you, and if you really try to focus and you can focus on something, can you recall that information? Are you able to regulate your attention, focus your attention, and then recall information? I think that can be really comforting for someone with a dementia presentation. Even if they attend and they're really focused, the capacity to learn and recall new information fails. Whereas someone who has that more brain fog presentation or attention difficulties, they will be able to focus and learn and retain and recall information if they can regulate their attention or focus their attention. So I think that's something small that someone can try, just to try and better understand what's happening inside their heads and where the failure might be, whether it's at the attention end of the memory processes or more at the memory end per se.
Yeah, so it's really about tapping into yourself as a resource as well, and learning how to use different coping strategies, or I guess resilience in itself, which is trying to figure out ways in which you can get through this, and using strategies, reaching out to people and trying to figure things out, as opposed to, like we talked about before, just accepting things for what they are.
Yeah, exactly. Again, as you mentioned earlier, sort of being curious, trying out different things, see what works for you, what helps you, what's not so helpful. Think about when your cognition might be failing you. Is it only when you're super stressed and super stretched? Is it when you're really tired, or is it all the time? Because that can also be helpful in you sort of trying to think about why you're experiencing different things. Again, not accepting things, being curious and trying different strategies.
Yeah, certainly. Well, thank you so much, Caroline, for coming on the show and chatting to us about this. I feel like it's such an important topic because, like we mentioned throughout this entire episode, it's so important to have these conversations, to build curiosity and make people feel like this is something that they can talk about. And like you also said, we're increasingly talking about this topic more and more. So I feel like this is just perfect to add fuel to that fire and just let people know that it's okay to talk about.
Absolutely, yes. And we want people to, build resilience and be able to thrive and optimize their cognition and their mental health. So a great starting point is just having conversations.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really had a really great time talking to you.
Thank you, Joanna. I enjoyed it as well. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And last but not least, if people want to find out a bit more about your work and what you do, where can they go?
Yeah, so there's a couple of places. So one is the Her Centre Australia website, which is through Monash University. So that's where all of my research sits. And that's one website. And then in terms of clinical practice, I'm a partner in a neuropsychology practice, which is very creatively called the Neuropsychology Practice. So that would be the other place that people can find me.
Beautiful. Well, for those of you who missed it, we've got Caroline's details down in the description below as well. But thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you all next time. You have been listening to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by the Life Management Science Labs. Listen to episodes from LMSL's 10 Life Management Perspectives on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or other podcasting apps on your smartphone. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it and us grow to bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website, pr.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Joanna. Thanks for tuning in.